Hi, I'm Hsing-ay Shu. I have the pleasure of talking to journalist Tara Connell today at Chautauqua, New York. You are a great listener when you are interviewing people as a journalist at USA Today, or you were the vice president of communications and you're directing how other people are listening at Gannett. You are listening as a multi-dimensional operation. Yeah. And now you've been getting into music listening. I should say getting back to, because you were a flutist. So how is your music listening growing recently?
Well, thanks to you, actually. You helped connect the emotions of listening to the actual music. Hearing different sounds, hearing melodies, and putting it all together so that I actually listened with my full brain.
As you know, I've been trying to learn how to write better. So I'm actually doing a Public Voices fellowship through the Op-Ed project, and I am starting to learn how to appreciate how elements of writing are so important. Thinking about how to approach it rather than just writing what I feel like. Let's talk a little bit about how fascinating it is to pair how we both approach these same elements that I think of as musical elements, but they are all there in news articles, in op-eds. And so, for instance, harmonic color in music, that would be chord progressions that are taking us through tension and release. And then when we have a resolution, there's this feeling of satisfaction and closure. But how do you go about creating tension and release?
You take a core piece of information or pieces of information and deciding what's important for your reader to know and what you want your reader to know. And
that would be the melody.
Of course.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. Sometimes the nature of a news story is enough tension as it is. It's the facts that give the tension and release. The fact that a person is found who's been lost is enough tension and release. In a feature story or speech writing or op-ed, you want to draw a reader in by developing a narrative that builds on the tension, and then you give them a reveal set in a story where, and then this happened, and that's a release of the tension that you've been building up in the story. A lot of it, you have to have more information than you reveal in the story. There has to be a background to the story that you give the sense that you are more knowledgeable about the story than you're revealing, and then you have the story. You give them that information. So it's what you it's the words you use, it's the verbs you use, it's the adjectives you choose to use that pull this. It's the colors, as we talked about at one point, the colors that you're giving to people, that active verbs, passive verbs. A train wreck, for instance. There's been a train wreck. Several people are hurt. This same train company has had 6 train wrecks in the last 3 years. Yes, you see there. Now the people are going, oh, I see what's going on here. And then the train went off the tracks. The company's been told to fix their tracks. They apparently didn't fix this stretch of tracks. I mean, so there is, you use facts, but you use the place where you put the facts as the way you build up the tension.
Is that maybe like development?
Yes.
Developing a theme into something larger, and it starts to go places, and you start to follow and see kind of the larger picture, what the music and the real emotions are as it develops.
And that can be in a straight little news story, or if you're really developing a bigger picture, you do that in a bigger feature story, and you can build to a crescendo of information by starting slow and pulling it out and giving them a much bigger picture.
Yeah. So I think we're talking about structure now,
Yes.
right? Well, first off, like the scope of it, like a feature is much bigger.
Mm-hmm.
So like maybe a sonata or a symphony,
Mm-hmm.
something with multiple parts,
Mm-hmm.
multiple movements,
Mm-hmm.
and they tie together somehow. And I think of like Beethoven's late sonatas, we were just hearing one,
Mm-hmm.
how he was really conceiving the entire sonata as one cohesive unit,
Mm-hmm.
rather than the old way of having a few movements that contrast each other, kind of
Mm-hmm.
like a potpourri.
Mm-hmm.
He was thinking of it as one cohesive whole with several parts that develop through time.
It's interesting. Old-timey journalism was always very much just a series of facts. Boom, 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 boom. They didn't have to tie together. They didn't have to have any meaning. They didn't have. That was the point. You just threw facts into a pile and served it up. As journalism has developed, it has become very much writing a cohesive story where it made sense to people. It was a narrative. It was. You drew people in so that they were encouraged to read from the beginning to the end, so they knew what happens. Used to be where, what, when, why, how, but just a pile of facts, bits and pieces, and people expected that. And now it's much more developed. People, in fact, don't even feel compelled to give the main piece of the story at the top of it anymore. They pull you in a little more slowly into some stories.
Even teeny tiny short news stories, you're trying to be
Clever.
kind of really. In music, we think about producing dynamics with the touch, like how softly can you actually approach the keys, how softly and slowly, and then with big crescendos, how much time does it take to build to the climax, and then what are the bigger muscles of your body that you're using to produce that muscular whatever bang.
Right.
Okay, so let's talk about how you do that, how you create dynamics.
Well, words are really critical to the power of a story. The words you choose to use, the placement of the words.
The placement within the sentence?
Within the sentence.
What's stronger?
Any sentence that begins with the is much less dynamic than a sentence that begins with a verb or an adjective. A sentence that has an active beginning is much more intense than a sentence that begins with a subordinate clause, for instance.
Like?
The soup was delicious, the boy said. Even though he didn't like soup, he sipped on the soup. Sipping soup was so much more fun than he thought it could be. It was delicious. There are just different ways to structure a sentence, and always, you have to vary your sentence structures always, but you're beginning with active verbs, active thoughts, and diving right into a sentence rather than backing into a sentence or a thought is always much more dynamic. It's hard to state a fact unless you know the fact and believe the fact. I read a lot of writing now, especially in journalism, where people aren't convinced of their ideas. It happens with a lot of writing.
Is liability an issue?
Yes, it is, actually. But liability will get you, whether you've been wishy-washy in your writing or not, if you don't have your facts. So you might as well go for it. I find when I'm backing away from stating something, then I'm either unsure of the fact or I'm unsure of what I believe in the fact. And you really, and it comes through in the writing.
But it's a skill. It's not so much whether you believe. Like, I can think of Robin Williams. It doesn't matter what he was doing. He was so committed. Even if I don't believe in something, I can play as if that was like the only way to do it.
Yeah.
But as a performer, if I were to maybe take lots of extra time on just a generic 5-chord, where the composer didn't intend for it to be very interesting or dynamic, and it's just kind of a bridge, and I decide I'm just going to gush over this 5-chord, I think that's where you might feel, it's like, get on with the story.
I hear rhythm in writing. Even in a newsroom with people standing around me, when I'm writing something, I try to repeat out loud what I've written so that I can hear how it sounds. I'm not sure that's the same thing you're talking about, but
like an iambic
yes,
meter.
pentameter.
Yeah.
But I know that if I have trouble saying a sentence out loud that I've written, then people will have trouble reading it in their head and have trouble understanding what they've just read. So the rhythm of a sentence is very important, and then when you read the whole story together, you can make a story go slowly. You can make a story go quickly. You can have people read a story and sort of linger. It feels lush.
We're talking about tempo now.
Is that different from what you were talking about?
Tempo, yeah, like how fast or slow, and you control that by the complexity of your sentences.
Complexity of your sentences, the bigness or smallness of words, the number of subordinate clauses you use, the number of sentences in a paragraph. You shorten up the paragraphs if you want to go faster. But it's also the lilt of the sentence, how it sounds out loud as you read it.
Can you give me an example?
I don't know. If I put single short sentences all together in a story, it would read very quickly. And then I would just throw in one subordinate clause or two just to slow people down a little bit. Because sometimes if you read it too quickly, you don't grasp what you just read.
Simple isn't necessarily clearer.
Correct.
Yeah, because we're both dealing with a time grid. Yeah.
When you want to describe something, he liked the lake because it was green, rough, and windy, That was your thing. But that's not necessarily a better way to describe a lake. The lake was blue and windy on a day when otherwise it was calm. It's you really have to pick a way that is a better way to describe things than just your choppy adjectives, even though the choppy adjectives can move the story along.
And so that brings us to articulation of the choppiness, which is staccato, like short bursts, versus the legato, which is thinking about how do you make it smooth, the smooth read. Yeah.
And so when you're presenting the story, is it the feeling that the lake was choppy, gray, and windy? Or was it this overall feeling of serenity even with the wind blowing?
You're directing the focus.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, you have to get a better way of describing something
and
based on the experience.
Yeah, and that is voicing.
That's
voicing, because when there's maybe 4 different voices happening at the same time, which voice do you want people to pay attention to over the others?
Yes. If somebody says the right thing, quotes are always the best way to give a little burst to a story that's otherwise just an expository piece of writing. So a quote would be a little trill.
A little ornamentation.
An ornamentation.
Yeah. You use imagery for news writing. To evoke the emotions. Using something that is outside of your own opinion. Right? So you think of imagery as something more concrete.
Yeah. Well, I would use somebody else's description of what happened, and that's the imagery that I would choose to use. It would have to stay, to be true journalism, it would have to stay within the limits of fact. I heard something and saw people reacting. Those are images I would use in a story. Very, very important images in a story.
That involves the senses.
Exactly.
Yeah. If someone is not having a good emotional connection with a piece, I would say, what imagery can we come up with to make it more real? We might even make up a scene or a storyline or something to make it more alive and more involving the senses and involving a narrative. Yeah, but that is purely imagination. The beauty of music is that it is abstract. It is the opposite of having the truth that you investigate. It is a kind of truth that is felt. And it does also require a full brain, but in a way that allows and invites interpretation in a way that journalism tries to be very careful
Pure
about.
journalism. Yeah. I mean, feature a magazine writing, to some extent, you have some leeway in how you present.
Let's tackle a really hard one.
Okay.
Texture. We were kind of dancing around texture because it's so linked to the tempo, the rhythm, the dynamics, but the density of a piece of music.
My enemy always in stories was complexity. What you don't want to do, especially in journalism, is you don't want people to drop the story and go looking for a dictionary, because they won't come back. You don't want them to put the paper down,
And that's harder because people have less patience these days.
Well, and now they're not reading papers so much. They're looking on their phones and they'll just abandon the story. I do it. I don't read long stories anymore.
Yeah.
If the paragraphs are big and chunky, I lose interest. I need smaller little bites of people who use complex sentence structures and repeat themselves to be very, very difficult. And a lot of journalism does that. Complex sentence structures and repeating yourself. Don't do that.
That's the medical world.
Yeah.
Redundancy for safety.
It is that.
Well, I think all this reminds me of this dichotomy as musicians and as journalists, that we are trying to be educators on one hand, and then we're trying to be entertaining at the same time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's hard to be both at the same time.
Yeah. Well, especially when you're trying to give difficult information or, new information, new things, things that people haven't heard before and may not really want to hear. You have to bring a reader into your story with you, the way we've been talking about bringing the listener into the music with you.
Yeah, and that's a evergreen challenge for musicians is the music that we care so much about maybe is not something that we can bring to the public.
Right.
What I'm doing with Conscious Listening, I hope, is trying to encourage new audiences to try something they haven't tried or they thought was too hard or too dense. And maybe it's not. Maybe it's just this fear of getting started. Because you do have to build your skills. And so as readers of newspapers, there is also a skill set of being a reader, a quick reader, one who can make associations with other stories and make sense of things. Do you ever feel like that's possible in journalism to create a better readership, a better quality of audience?
I think right this minute, journalism is going through such a difficult transition. A lot of print journalism is gone. Local print journalism is gone or going. I think hyperlocal might be existing, and hyperlocal writing is a challenge. It's all very young people learning to write. There's a different kind of journalism that's going on out there. There are different formats. You can see it. The New York Times is sort of getting the idea a lot. They use small bites of information. They don't cover breaking news stories the way they used to. They just post breaking stuff as it's happening. People maybe even just dictating into a machine. It's not writing so much anymore. And now you have podcasts, are a whole other kind of journal. I'm doing a podcast for my group. That's a whole different kind of writing. That's journalism, and more like music actually than anything I've done before in terms of writing, because I'm very tuned into what the words sound like because I'm writing for someone who's going to read them.
Well, one thing I find frustrating with the idea of musical education for most people is that you have to avoid doing things wrong.
Yeah.
And I find that in journalism, it must be really hard too, because even if you say, the duck is black, somebody else might say, well, why are you defining it as a duck and not a bird, right?
Right.
There's always somebody wanting to say you're doing it wrong. Imagine for us what journalism 5 years down the road is?
From here,
Yeah.
I think local newspapers will be pretty much gone, and especially the paper. The replacement will be web-based. I think hyper-local newspapers will continue, meaning small-time, non-profit newspapers that arrive in your mailbox and you don't buy them necessarily, they just get there. That'll continue to be there, and there won't be much in between that. TV journalism will start to fade out, and there'll still be a New York Times, there'll still be a Washington Post, and a Los Angeles paper, and a big city journalism.
All right. Let's meet our listening audience.
Very
We
excited.
had
Hey,
an
Riley.
audience,
Hey, Riley.
and we put him to sleep. Oh.
Thank you for being such a quiet listener.